The stars had never looked so cold as they did through the observation window of the Celestin. And Commander Alira Voss found herself counting them like she used to count the freckles on her mother's face. When she was a child back on Earth, she had been standing there for nearly an hour, a reflection ghosting across the reinforced glass. When the door behind her hissed open and the familiar scent of ozone and something like lavender filled the room, "You are avoiding the delegation hall," Cyril said. Her voice, carrying harmonics that no human throat could ever produce, Alira did not turn around, keeping her eyes fixed on the distant spiral arm of the galaxy where Earth waited somewhere in the darkness. "I needed air," she replied. "There is no air here," Cyril said. And Alira could hear the confusion in her tone. The way the Ethrans still struggled with human expressions even after 18 months of studying them. Of studying her, it is a figure of speech. Ah, Cyril moved closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift, growing warmer as the luminescent being approached. "Another one of your strange word games that mean nothing and everything at once." Alira finally turned, and even now, after all this time, the sight of Cyril still made her breath catch in her chest. The Ethran stood nearly 7 feet tall, her form wrapped in light that shifted between colors humans had no names for, her eyes like pools of liquid starlight that held millennia of knowledge and experience, and somewhere in those ancient depths, something that looked remarkably like love. "The High Council grows impatient," Cyril said. "They have waited 3 hours for your answer, and they are not accustomed to waiting. Then, perhaps waiting will be good for them." Cyril made a sound that might have been a laugh if her species understood humor the way humans did. "You continue to surprise me, Alira Voss, even now, even after I have spent 18 of your months learning every detail of your culture, your history, your biology." She paused, and her light flickered with something like frustration. "I still cannot predict what you will say or do next. Is that why you chose me?" The question hung in the recycled air between them, heavy with meaning that both of them understood, but neither had ever spoken. Aloud, Cyril moved to stand beside Alira at the window, a reflection overlapping with the human woman's in the glass, light and shadow merging together. "I chose you because when I first saw you at the Concordat negotiations, you were the only being in that room who looked at me and did not see a god," Cyril said softly. "You saw a person, and you were not afraid. Should I have been afraid? My species has destroyed civilizations that displeased us. Alira, we have rewritten the laws of physics to suit our needs. We have conquered death itself and made eternity our plaything." Cyril turned to face her, and her light grew brighter, more intense. "Every other species in this galaxy trembles when we enter a room. But you small and fragile and impossibly brave creature, you looked at me and asked if I wanted something to drink." Alira felt a smile tugging at her lips despite the weight pressing down on her heart. "You look thirsty. We do not experience thirst." "I know that now." They stood in silence for a moment, and Alira thought about all the times over the past 18 months when Cyril had appeared at her door, curious about some human custom or confused by some piece of slang, and how those visits had slowly transformed into something deeper, something that neither of them had expected or planned for. "The fleet departs in 72 hours," Cyril said finally, breaking the silence. "We are returning to the space beyond the galactic rim, to the place where my people have made their home for the last 1,000,000 years. And we will not return. I know, if you do not come with me, we will never see each other again." "I know that too." Cyril's form flickered, and when she spoke again, her voice carried frequencies that Alira had never heard before, sounds that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and speak directly to something deep inside her chest. "Then come with me," Cyril said. And it was not a command or a request, but something in between. Something desperate and ancient and achingly vulnerable. I am offering you immortality, Alira. I am offering you access to knowledge that your species will not discover for another million years. I am offering you a place at my side for all of eternity. And what would I have to give up? The question seemed to catch Cyril off guard, and her light dimmed slightly as she considered her answer. Your world, she admitted. Your people, your position. Everything that ties you to this small corner of the universe. My humanity, Cyril did not deny it. You would become something greater. Something beyond the limitations of flesh and bone and time. I would become something other than what I am. Yes, Alira turned back to the window. To the stars. To the distant light of a sun she might never see again. And she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Give me 3 days. She said. Cyril went very still, and her light pulsed with colors that Alira could not interpret. 3 days? 72 hours. You said that is how long until the fleet departs. Alira faced her again, meeting those ancient eyes without flinching. Give me until then to make my decision. No one has ever asked the Ethrans to wait. Then I am asking now. Something shifted in Cyril's expression. Something that looked almost like respect mixed with frustration, and then that ever-present confusion that humans seem to inspire in her. The council will not understand. Then help him understand. Cyril was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had hardened into something formal and distant. Very well. Commander Alira Voss of the human vessel Celestin, I am giving you one chance, she said. And each word fell like a stone into still water. Choose me now, or lose me forever. You have 3 of your days to decide. She turned and moved toward the door, her light casting strange shadows across the walls. But she paused at the threshold and looked back. I hope you understand what you are risking, she said softly. Alira watched her go, and when the door closed behind her, she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. I hope I do too, she whispered to the empty room and the uncaring stars outside the window. The Ethran fleet hung in the darkness like a constellation of impossible beauty, and somewhere among those ships, an immortal being was learning what it felt like to wait, and for the first time in her very long existence, Cyril was afraid. 17 hands of poker. Cyril had lost 17 consecutive hands of poker to a human whose brain was smaller than one of the data crystals in her personal archive. She stared at the cards in front of her, running calculations that would have taken human computers centuries to complete. And still she could not understand how she kept losing. This game is flawed, she said finally, and her light pulsed with frustration that made the overhead lights flicker in response. The game is not flawed, Alira said as she gathered the cards for another shuffle. You are just playing it wrong. I have analyzed every possible combination of cards, calculated the probability of each hand, factored in the statistical likelihood of your bluffs based on your previous patterns. Cyril leaned forward, and her voice carried harmonics of genuine bewilderment. By every measure of logic and mathematics, I should have won at least 12 of those hands. And yet you did not. How? Alira stopped shuffling and set the deck down on the table between them. Tell me something, Cyril. When was the last time you did something just because it felt good? The question seemed to catch the Ethran off guard, and her light dimmed slightly as she considered it. I do not understand the question. When was the last time you did something that had no purpose, no goal, no outcome that benefited you or your people in any measurable way? Cyril was silent for a long moment. We do not do things without purpose, she said finally. Every action we take is calculated to achieve optimal results. Every decision is weighed against the potential benefits and costs. This is how we have survived for millions of years. This is how we have achieved what no other species has achieved. And this is why you keep losing at poker. Alira picked up the deck and began dealing again, her movements slow and deliberate. You are playing to win, Cyril. You are calculating odds and analyzing patterns and trying to predict my behavior based on logical models. Is that not how the game is meant to be played? That is how mathematics is meant to be done. But poker is not mathematics. Poker is art. She finished dealing and picked up her own cards. And that smile appeared on her face again, the one that drove Cereval to distraction. I am not playing to win. Alira continued. I am playing because it is fun. Because this moment right here, sitting across from a confused immortal and teaching her something she has never known before. This is why I exist. Cereval looked at her cards without really seeing them. You play without caring about the outcome? I play because the playing itself is the point. That makes no sense. I know. Alira laughed, and the sound was bright and warm in the small room. That is what makes it beautiful. They played 3 more hands, and Cereval lost all of them. But something had shifted in her awareness. Something she could not quite name. She found herself watching Alira more closely. Not analyzing her tells or calculating her patterns, but simply observing the way she moved, the way she smiled, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was genuinely amused. Can I ask you something? Cereval said as Alira gathered. The cards once more. You can ask me anything. Are you not afraid? Alira paused, and for a moment her expression grew serious. Afraid of what? Of death, of the end, of the moment when everything you are simply stops existing. Cereval leaned forward, and her light grew brighter with intensity. My people eliminated death because we could not bear the thought of ending, of all that we had learned and experienced simply vanishing into nothing. How can you sit here and laugh and play games when you know that you will cease to exist in such a short time? Alira was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. My mother died when I was 23 years old. Cereval went very still. She had cancer, a disease that slowly ate away at her body over the course of 2 years, and I watched her grow weaker and thinner and more tired with each passing month. Alira set the cards down and folded her hands on the table. In the last weeks of her life, when she could barely move from her bed, I asked her if she was scared. What did she say? She said that she had been scared once when she was young and thought that life was supposed to last forever. But then she realized something that changed everything. Alira looked up at Cereval, and her eyes held a depth of emotion that made the Ethrin's light flicker with something she could not identify. She realized that it was the ending that gave everything meaning. I do not understand. Think about it this way. Alira said, if you have infinite time, then nothing matters. Any experience you do not have today, you can have tomorrow or next year or in a million years. There is no urgency, no preciousness, no need to savor any single moment because there will always be another moment waiting. That is freedom. No. Cereval, that is emptiness. Alira reached across the table and took one of Cereval's hands in her own, and the touch sent ripples through the Ethrin's light that she could not control. When my mother held my hand in her final hours, every second of that touch was infinitely precious because we both knew it would end. When I watch a sunset, it is beautiful because I know I will not see infinite sunsets. When I tell someone I love them, those words carry weight because I know my time to say them is limited. She squeezed Cereval's hand gently. Death is not the enemy of life. It is the thing that makes life possible. Without an ending, nothing has a beginning or a middle either. Everything just stretches on forever in one long, meaningless blur. Cereval sat in silence, and for the first time in thousands of years, she felt something stirring in the parts of her consciousness that her people had long ago learned to ignore. My people removed death because we thought it was the greatest threat to our existence, she said slowly, but we never considered what else we might have removed along with it. And what was that? Cereval looked down at their joined hands, at the way Alira's small, fragile fingers rested against her own luminescent skin. The reason to exist at all. Alira smiled. And this time Cyril thought she might finally be beginning to understand what that smile meant. "You have lived for millions of years," Elira said softly, "but I wonder when was the last time you truly felt alive?" The question hung in the air between them, and Cyril found that she did not have an answer outside the small recreation room. The stars continued their endless dance. And somewhere in the distance, the Ethran fleet waited for a decision that would change everything. But in that moment, none of that mattered in that moment. There was only the warmth of a human hand and the terrifying, beautiful realization that perhaps the Ethrans had made a terrible mistake. They had conquered death, and in doing so, they had forgotten how to live. News traveled fast aboard the Celestin, and by the time the ship's artificial sunrise began to glow through the corridors, every crew member knew what had happened in the observation deck. Commander Elira Voss had asked an immortal god to wait. Whispers followed her everywhere she went that first morning. Soft voices that fell silent whenever she passed. Curious eyes that watched her from around corners and through half-open doorways she pretended not to notice. Instead, she made her way to the ship's small garden. A cramped space filled with plants from Earth that the crew had worked hard to keep alive during the long journey through deep space. The tomatoes were coming in nicely. She noticed as she knelt beside the raised beds and let her fingers sink into the dark soil. "I thought I might find you here," a voice said from behind her. Lieutenant James Chun stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest and a look of barely contained concern on his face. "The tomatoes need attention," Elira said without looking up. "The tomatoes are fine. You are the one everyone is worried about." Elira sat back on her heels and brushed the dirt from her hands. Taking her time before she answered, "There is nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about," Chun repeated. And his voice carried an edge of disbelief that made her want to smile despite everything. "Commander, you just told a being who could destroy our entire solar system with the thought that she needs to wait for your answer. I think there might be a few things worth worrying about. She would never hurt Earth. How can you be so sure?" Elira finally looked up at him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. "Because she loves me," she said simply, "and love does not destroy. It waits." Chun was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "You have already decided, have you not?" "I decided the moment she asked." "Then why the 3 days?" Elira stood and wiped her hands on her uniform, leaving dark streaks of earth across the fabric. "These 3 days are not for me, James. They are for her." She left him standing in the garden with more questions than answers. And she did not look back. The hours that followed were precious to her in ways she could not explain to anyone else. She spent the morning recording messages for her brother Marcus, telling him stories about their childhood that she had never shared before, laughing at memories of summer days spent catching fireflies in their grandmother's backyard. She told him she was proud of him, that she had always been proud of him. Even when they had not spoken for years, because of arguments neither of them could remember starting, she told him she loved him. And she meant every word. In the afternoon, she visited the mess hall and sat with the youngest members of her crew, listening to their stories about home, about the families waiting for them back on Earth, about the dreams they had for the future. Ensign Park wanted to open a restaurant when she returned, a small place by the ocean where she could cook the recipes her mother had taught her. Ensign Williams was saving money to buy a piece of land where he could raise horses. Real horses, not the holographic simulations they had on the station. Elira listened to each of them, and she filed their dreams away in her heart like treasures. When evening came, she retreated to her quarters and opened the old datapad that held her mother's letters, the ones she had saved from before the cancer had taken her, the ones filled with simple words about ordinary days that now felt more valuable than all the knowledge the Ethrans could offer. She read them slowly, savoring each sentence, each familiar turn of phrase, each "I love you," that still carried warmth even after all these years. And, while Alira moved through her days with quiet purpose, Cyril watched the Ethron had spent the first hours after their conversation in a state of confusion that bordered on distress, pacing through the corridors of her ship while her advisors exchanged worried glances. "She is grieving," one of them suggested, "preparing herself for the loss of her world. It is a natural response for such limited beings." "Perhaps," Cyril said. But something about the explanation did not feel right. She began to monitor the human ship more closely, using sensors that could detect the heat of a single heartbeat from 1,000 miles away. And what she found only deepened her confusion. Elar was not grieving. She was laughing with her crew, working in the garden with dirt under her fingernails, reading old letters with tears in her eyes that came from joy rather than sorrow. She was living. Why does she act as though she has already won? Cyril asked aloud, and none of her advisors could provide an answer that satisfied her on the second day. Cyril made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go to the human ship, not as a delegate or a god, but as something she had not been in thousands of years. She would go as a student. The shuttle bay of the Celestine was not designed for Ethron visitors, and Cyril had to dim her light considerably just to fit through the doorways without scorching the walls. The crew members she passed stared at her with wide eyes, pressing themselves against the bulkheads to let her through. But she barely noticed them. She was looking for Elirish, found her in a small recreation room on the lower deck, seated at a table covered in colorful pieces of paper and small round tokens. Across from her sat a young human with nervous hands and an expression of deep concentration. "Are bluffing," the young one said. "Am I?" Alira replied with a smile that revealed nothing. "You have to be. No one gets that lucky 3 times in a row." "Then call my bet and find out." The young human pushed forward a pile of tokens, and Alira laid her cards on the table. 4 of a kind. The young one groaned and dropped her head onto the table while Alira gathered the tokens with a laugh. It was only then that she looked up and saw Cyril standing in the doorway. "You came," Alira said, and there was no surprise in her voice, only warmth. "I needed to understand." "Understand what?" Cyril gestured at the table, at the cards, at the scattered tokens that seemed to hold no value at all. All of this. You have less than 2 days left to decide the fate of your entire existence, and you spend your time playing games. Alira looked at her for a long moment, and then she smiled, that infuriating human smile that Cyril had never been able to decipher. "Sit down," she said, and she gestured to the empty chair beside her. "I will teach you." The young ensign fled the room with a hasty excuse about duty shifts, and Cyril lowered herself into the seat, her light flickering with uncertainty. "I have mastered mathematical systems that your species cannot even comprehend," she said. "This is not about mathematics." Alira shuffled the cards with practiced ease, and the sound of them sliding together was strangely soothing in the quiet room. "This is about something much more complicated." She dealt the cards, and Cyril picked them up with hands that had shaped stars, wondering what possible lesson she could learn from pieces of painted paper. She was about to find out. The third day dawned without fanfare aboard the Celestine, and Alira Voss woke before the artificial sunrise began its programmed glow through her quarters. She lay still for a moment, listening to the hum of the ship around her, feeling the subtle vibration of the engines that had carried her so far from home. Today was the day she rose and dressed slowly, choosing her formal uniform instead of the casual clothes she had worn for the past 2 days. The fabric felt stiff against her skin after so long, but there was something right about facing this moment in the same clothes she had worn when she first met Cyril at the Concordat negotiations. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her sink, and she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There were more lines around her eyes than she remembered, more gray in her hair than she wanted to admit. But there was also something new in her expression, a kind of peace that she had not felt in a very long time. "Commander Voss," her communication device crackled to life. "The Ethrin delegate has requested your presence on the observation deck. The fleet is preparing departure sequences. Tell her I am on my way." She took one last look around her quarters, at the photographs on her desk and the books on her shelf and the small plant on her windowsill that she had grown from a seed her mother had given her. Then she walked out the door and did not look back. The corridors of the Celestin seemed longer than usual as she made her way to the observation deck, and every crew member she passed stopped to watch her go. Some of them nodded in respect, some of them looked at her with confusion or concern. Few of them, the ones who had served with her the longest, simply smiled. They understood Lieutenant Chen was waiting outside the observation deck, his posture rigid with tension. "Commander, I have to ask one more time. Are you certain about this?" Alira stopped and faced him, and she reached out to straighten the collar of his uniform the way she used to do before important meetings. "James, do you remember what you told me when you first joined my crew?" He blinked in surprise at the question. "I told you that I wanted to see the stars. And had you?" "More than I ever dreamed." Alira smiled and patted his shoulder. "Then my job is done." She walked past him before he could respond, and the doors to the observation deck slid open with a soft hiss. Saravel was standing at the window, her back to the door, her light dimmer than Alira had ever seen it beyond the glass. The Ethrin fleet hung like a constellation of impossible beauty, their engines glowing with the power of 1,000 suns as they prepared for the journey beyond the rim. "I wondered if you would come in your uniform," Saravel said without turning around. It seemed appropriate. "The humans I've studied usually dress formally for occasions of surrender or defeat." Alira walked slowly across the deck until she was standing beside the Ethrin, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her luminescent form. "Is that what you think this is?" Saravel finally turned to face her, and Alira saw something in those ancient eyes that she had never seen before: fear. "I do not know what this is," Saravel admitted. "I have spent the past 3 days trying to understand you, trying to analyze your behavior and predict your decision. And I am no closer to comprehension than I was when I first made my offer. Perhaps that is the point." "What do you mean?" Alira turned to face the window, watching the fleet's engines pulse with barely contained power. "You came to my species looking for something new, something different from the endless sameness of your immortal existence," she said. "You chose me because I surprised you, because I looked at a god and offered her a drink instead of falling to my knees. Yes, and then you asked me to give all of that up, to become something like you, something predictable and logical and eternal." Alira shook her head slowly. "Do you not see the contradiction?" Saravel was silent for a long moment. "You are refusing," she said finally, and her voice carried harmonics of pain that made the air itself seem to ache. "I am not refusing you." Alira turned to face her fully, and her eyes held a fierce kind of love that burned brighter than any Ethrin light. "I am refusing the price. I do not understand. You asked me to leave behind everything I am, my crew, my world, my humanity, the messy, chaotic, finite life that made me someone worth choosing in the first place." Alira stepped closer, close enough that she could see her own reflection in Saravel's luminescent skin. "You chose me because I am human, because I burned so briefly and so brightly that you could not look away. But then you asked me to stop being human so that you could keep me forever. I asked you to become something greater. No, Saravel, you asked me to become something less." The words hung between them like a physical barrier, and Alira watched as understanding slowly dawned in Saravel's ancient eyes. "I would not be me anymore." The Ethrin said slowly, "No. And if you are not you, Then what I feel for you would have no object. Yes, then I would be alone again, just with a companion wearing your face. Now you understand. Cyril turned back to the window, and her light flickered with colors that Alira could not interpret. My people would think me insane if I stayed. Probably, I would age. I would weaken. I would eventually die. Yes, and you offer me nothing in return except time with you. Limited, imperfect, finite time. Alira reached out and took Cyrivel's hand, and she felt the immortal tremble at the touch. I am offering you everything, she said softly. Every second will matter. Every choice will count. Every moment we share will be real because it will not last forever. Cyril looked down at their joined hands, and something shifted in her expression. I have lived for millions of years, she said. I have seen the birth and death of stars. I have watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore. I have accumulated knowledge that would take your species millennia to understand. She looked up at Alira, and her eyes held something that looked remarkably like hope. But I do not think I have ever truly lived. Not the way you mean it. Then live now, Alira said. Live with me, even if it is only for a little while. Let me show you what your people have forgotten. Let me teach you what mortality really means. The fleet's engines grew brighter as the departure sequence neared completion, and the observation deck was bathed in light from 1,000 Ethrin ships in just a few minutes. They would be gone forever, and Cyril had to choose. The light from the Ethrin fleet painted the observation deck in shades of gold and silver as Cyril stood motionless before the window. A million years of existence stretched behind her like an endless ocean. And somewhere in that vast expanse of time, she had forgotten what it felt like to stand at a crossroads. She had forgotten what it meant to choose commander to the observation deck. A voice crackled over the ship's communication system. The Ethrin High Council is requesting confirmation of Delegate Cyrivel's return to the fleet. They require her presence within the hour. Alira did not respond to the message, her eyes fixed on Cyrivel's face, watching the ancient being struggle with something that should have been simple. My people will not understand, Cyril said finally. No, they will think I have lost my mind, that the humans have somehow corrupted my consciousness. Probably, they will remove me from all records, erase my contributions from our history, act as though I never existed. Is that worse than never truly existing at all? Cyril turned to face her, and her light pulsed with emotions that her species had thought extinct. You asked me to give up everything I have ever known, everything I have ever been. For what? She gestured between them with a hand that trembled slightly. For this. For a few decades of partnership with a creature who will wither and die before I have finished my morning meditations? Yes. The simplicity of Alira's answer seemed to strike Cyril like a physical blow. You humans are insane. We prefer the term hopeful, a sound escaped. Cyril, that might have been a laugh if her species remembered how to produce such things. Hope, she repeated, and the words sounded strange in her harmonics, like a language she was only beginning to learn. My people abandoned hope millions of years ago. We calculated that it was inefficient, a waste of cognitive resources that could be better spent on more productive pursuits. And how did that work out for you? Cyril looked back at the fleet, at the ships that had carried her people across the universe and beyond, at the engines that contained enough power to reshape reality itself. We achieved everything we set out to achieve, she said slowly. We conquered death, mastered the laws of physics, accumulated knowledge beyond measure. But we never asked ourselves why. Cyrivel's light flickered with something that looked like sorrow. We were so focused on survival that we forgot to consider what we were surviving for. The communication system crackled again. Delegate Cyril, this is the High Council. We require your immediate response. The departure sequence cannot be delayed further. Cyril closed her eyes. And for a long moment she simply stood there, her light pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. When she opened her eyes again, there was something new in them. Something fierce and terrified and impossibly bright. "I have lived for millions of years," she said, and her voice carried a strength that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "I have seen and done things that no human could ever imagine. I have been powerful and wise and eternal." She reached out and took Alira's hands in her own. "And I have been so desperately, achingly lonely that I had forgotten what loneliness felt like." Alira squeezed her hands gently. "You do not have to be lonely anymore." "No," Cyril agreed. "I do not." She released Alira's hands and stepped back, her form growing brighter until the entire observation deck was filled with light. "High Council," she said, and her voice carried frequencies that reached across the void to every ship in the fleet. "This is Delegate Cyril. I will not be returning." The silence that followed was deafening. "Repeat your transmission," a voice said finally. "Cold and confused. There appears to be an error in our communication systems." "There is no error. I am choosing to remain with the humans. I am choosing mortality. That is not possible. No Ethrin has ever made such a choice. Then I will be the first." She turned to face the window, and her light dimmed to something almost human. "I hereby renounce my place among the Ethran people. I surrender my immortality, my position, my claim to the knowledge we have accumulated over the millennia." "You cannot do this." The voice from the fleet was no longer cold. It was panicked. "You do not understand what you are giving up." "No," Cyril said softly. "For the first time in millions of years, I finally understand what I'm gaining." The fleet hung motionless for a long moment. And then, without another word, the engines flared to full power. Alira watched as the ships began to move. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, until they were nothing but streaks of light against the darkness in minutes. They were gone. The observation deck fell silent, and Cyril stood before the window where the fleet had been, her light dim and steady. "They are gone," she said. "Yes, they will not return." "No." Cyril turned to face Alira, and something that looked remarkably like a smile crossed her luminescent features. "I believe this is the part where you are supposed to say something reassuring." Alira laughed, and the sound was warm and bright in the empty room. "How about this?" she said, and she reached out to take Cyril's hand once more. "I am giving you one chance, Ethrin. Choose me now, or lose me forever." Cyril's light flickered with amusement. "I believe I have already made my choice." "Then welcome to humanity," Alira said. "We are messy and chaotic, and we make terrible decisions. But we have really good food and even better stories. I look forward to learning both." They stood together before the window, watching the stars, and somewhere across the galaxy, word began to spread the Ethrins had departed. But they had left something behind. One of their own had chosen mortality, had chosen love, had chosen hope, and in the centuries that followed, species who had never dared to dream began to whisper among themselves. The humans, they said, had a kind of madness, a beautiful, terrifying, contagious madness that could make even gods want to be mortal. They called it hope, and for the first time in eons, the universe remembered what it meant to be alive on the observation deck of the Celestin. Alira Voss and Cyril watched the stars together, their hands intertwined, their futures uncertain, but they were not afraid because they had each other and they had time. And they had learned something that the immortals had forgotten. The ending was not something to fear. It was the beginning of everything that mattered, and their story was just getting started.